The iron gate creaked as the door opened slowly, and the light from the hallway hit the dark corner of the room, where the alien girl sat curled up in chains with her silver blue skin bruised and her long hair messy and tangled as she stared at the floor without blinking, because blinking would mean she was still hoping, and she had learned to stop hoping a long time ago, since every time she hoped, something worse happened, and today felt like one of those days again. The voices outside were shouting numbers and names and deals as the slave auction was going on in full motion, and the stench of sweat, metal, and fear mixed in the air, so thick it could choke even the strongest lungs. And the girl heard footsteps nearing her cage, which was the smallest and darkest among all the others, because she was considered cursed by many and valuable by a few who thought her strange markings made her worth more and dangerous. At the same time, a human voice spoke to the auctioneer, asking about her, and she looked up for a second, expecting a young, loud buyer, or maybe a cruel soldier who would use her like the others before. But instead, she saw a middle-aged human man with tired eyes and a kind face, and no whip or weapon in his hands. And that confused her more than anything else, because kind faces usually came before the worst pain. The auctioneer laughed nervously, saying she was too strange even for collectors, and had been returned twice already, because she screamed in her sleep and sometimes made lights flicker when she was angry or afraid. And the man only nodded as if none of it scared him or mattered, and raised his hand quietly, offering a few silver coins that made the auctioneer scoff, but then agree anyway. Because no one else had bid for her in days, the girl was pulled roughly from the cage, and her feet dragged on the metal floor as chains clanged against each other, and her heart beat faster, and her mind screamed to run or bite or scratch. But she stayed still, because this was her life now, and maybe it would be over soon, and maybe that would be okay. But then something unexpected happened, as the man took off his own coat and gently placed it over her shoulders and said something in a soft voice that made her pause. He said, "You are safe now," and those words made no sense, because no one said that, no one ever meant it, and yet she felt warmth from the coat, and from his voice, and from his strange calm presence, like he didn't see her as a thing, but as someone, and that made her legs weak in a way that wasn't fear, and she stumbled, but he caught her without flinching, and walked with her slowly away from the wax. Everyone stared as they left the auction house, and some laughed, while others whispered behind their hands, saying the human had gone mad and bought a cursed one, and that he would regret it soon, and that she would kill him in his sleep. But the man ignored them, and led her to a small hover cart parked outside, and helped her sit in the back seat like she was a guest, not a prisoner, and that confused her even more. She expected to be locked up again once they reached his home, maybe in a smaller cage or a dark room with chains on the wall. But instead, the place he brought her to was a simple wooden cabin at the edge of a quiet forest, with no guards, no cages, and no locks on the doors and windows. And that felt even more dangerous, because she didn't know how to protect herself from kindness he showed her. The kitchen, the small room with a bed, and even the water source nearby, and then stepped back, saying, "This is your space now, and you can leave if you want." And she stared at him, thinking it was a test or maybe a game, but he only smiled and said his name was Thomas, and that she could call him whatever she liked or nothing at all, and then he left the room, giving her space to breathe. She sat on the bed, not knowing if it was real or if she was already dreaming, and tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, her body braced for pain that never came. And that night, as she lay curled up in the corner out of habit, with the coat still around her, she realized something strange, something terrifying. She was not afraid of Thomas, and that scared her more than anything else the next morning, when she woke up to the smell of warm bread and soft humming from the other room. She thought for the first time, maybe this human was different, and maybe her story was not over yet, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The sun rose slowly over the tall trees that surrounded the small wooden house, where the alien girl now stayed, and the light crept through the window as she opened her eyes to find herself still, wrapped in the same coat that Thomas had given her, and for a moment she forgot where she was and who she was, because the silence around her was gentle, and the air smelled clean, and no one was shouting or hurting or pulling her away, and that feeling made her heart race with confusion. She stood slowly looking around the room, expecting someone to yell or order her to kneel or clean or run. But there was no sound except for birds chirping outside and the soft sound of something boiling, and she moved carefully toward the door, peeking through the crack, and saw Thomas in the kitchen, stirring something in a small pot with a calm look on his face. Like this was normal and expected, and not at all strange to have an alien girl living in his home. He saw her watching and smiled and said good morning in a tone so gentle it made her freeze, because she had only known loud, angry voices, and this voice felt too soft, like it would disappear if she touched it, and she waited for the trick to appear, but it never did, and Thomas simply turned back to the pot and added something that made the room smell even warmer, like herbs and comfort. She walked into the room slowly, half expecting a trapdoor or a shock collar to be waiting, but there was nothing, just a chair and a plate and a cup, and Thomas motioned for her to sit, and she hesitated, then sat on the edge, like it might break or vanish, but it held her weight, and he placed a bowl of food in front of her, not with force, but with care, like she was a person and not a thing, and the bowl was full of soft grains and sweet roots she had not tasted in years. She ate slowly, watching his every move and wondering why he didn't lock the doors or chain her wrist or even ask her name, and when he finally sat across from her with his own bowl, he asked if she was comfortable, and she nodded, unsure of what to say, because the words inside her were locked away after so much silence and pain, but his eyes told her he did not need her to speak just yet. For breakfast, Thomas showed her the rest of the house, and every room was open and quiet and simple, with no weapons, no secrets, no hidden rooms, and when they reached the front door, he opened it wide and stepped aside, saying she was free to leave if she wanted, and the wind outside touched her skin, and the trees whispered her name, but her feet did not move because she had nowhere to go, and no one waiting for her, and for the first time she realized the cage was gone, but she was not ready to fly. She stayed near the fire most of the day, watching it dance and trying to remember who she was before chains and before fear, and Thomas worked outside, fixing a fence and planting seeds in the garden, and sometimes he hummed a tune she did not know, but it made her chest feel strange, like maybe there was still something good in the world. And when he returned inside with dirt on his hands and asked she wanted to learn to plant, she said yes with a voice so small it almost vanished. The next morning she woke before the sun and walked to the door again and opened it, slowly stepping outside into the fresh air that smelled like rain and moss, and she looked around at the trees and sky and felt her lungs fill with something she had not felt in years. And when she turned to see Thomas watching her from the window with no anger in his eyes, just quiet patience, she felt something inside her shift, like a door opening slowly in her chest. That night, she found a book on the table and opened it with shaking hands, and though the words were hard, she traced them with her finger, trying to remember the language she once knew, and Thomas saw her and sat beside her and read each word, softly pointing and waiting and smiling when she repeated them, and she felt like a child again, but not in a bad way, in a way that meant she could grow and learn and live again. Every day after that was slow and soft, like waves brushing the shore, and each small moment felt bigger than anything she had known before, like eating fruit from the tree or touching water that wasn't cold or seeing the stars without bars blocking them. And Thomas never rushed her, never asked questions that hurt, and when she woke from nightmares, he left a cup of warm tea beside her door without a word. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and painted the sky with gold and fire, she sat on the steps outside the house, and Thomas joined her, and after a long silence, she asked him why he helped her, why he did not treat her like the others. And he looked at the sky and said, "Because no one helped me when I needed it, and maybe this is how I fix that." And she looked at him and saw not a man, but something closer to a story that had not ended yet. The wind moved through the trees like a soft voice calling out secrets that no one else could hear, and the alien girl stood still at the edge of the garden with her hands deep in the soil as she planted small seeds Thomas had given her, and her fingers trembled, not because she was afraid, but because she was feeling something she had forgotten a long time ago, and the sun warmed her shoulders, and for the first time, she did not flinch at the light. Thomas worked quietly beside her, fixing a broken wooden post, and his hands were steady as he hammered the nail down, and she watched him from the corner of her eye, wondering how someone could be so gentle and yet so strong, and she wanted to ask him many things, but her voice still feared its own sound, and so she stayed quiet, but her thoughts were louder now, and they whispered. Maybe, just maybe, she was safe. Later that day, he brought out a large bowl of fruits from a nearby tree and placed them on the small table under the open sky, and invited her to sit with a wave of his hand, and she hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him. And they ate in silence with only the birds and the wind between them, and then Thomas picked up one of the round red fruits and made a funny face before biting it loudly, pretending it was the best thing in the galaxy, and her lips twitched without warning. He did it again, and each time he added a new sound or face, and though she tried not to react, her body betrayed her, and a small sound escaped her throat, and her lips curved upward just a little, just enough, and that was the first time she smiled. And Thomas saw it, and didn't say a word, but his eyes lit up like stars in the night, and she felt a strange warmth in her chest that was not fear. That night she could not sleep and sat by the fire inside the small house, while Thomas rested in the other room, and she stared at the flames dancing slowly and remembered the faces of her family long lost, and the sound of her mother's voice, and the smell of her father's tools, and the way her little sister used to laugh, and she closed her eyes as the memory burned brighter than the fire, and a tear slid down her cheek. Thomas walked in quietly and saw her sitting there with that look of someone caught between yesterday and today, and he didn't speak. He just sat beside her and handed her a small cloth, and she wiped her face and looked at him and finally asked his name, and he said, "Thomas." And when he asked for hers, she paused because she had been called many things, but none of them were hers, and she didn't know what name belonged to her anymore. He said that was okay, and names could wait, and people were more than what others called them, and she nodded slowly, and for a moment the silence between them felt like a bridge and not a wall, and she wanted to tell him about the stars her people used to follow and the stories carved into their skin, but the words stayed locked behind a door she was still learning how to open. The next morning, Thomas found her sweeping the porch with slow, careful movements, and he smiled and said, "Thank you." And she looked up surprised because no one had ever thanked her before, and that single word felt bigger than the sky and heavier than the chains she used to wear, and she looked down quickly, but he said it again softer, and she whispered, "You are welcome," in a voice as fragile as glass. Day after that was filled with tiny pieces of light, like finding a new fruit near the fence, or learning the word for rain in his language, or fixing a broken chair together, and she even tried to draw on the wooden table with a piece of coal from the fire. And though the shape was not perfect, Thomas said it was beautiful, and she laughed without thinking, and the sound startled her more than him. She began to walk around the forest, alone, not far, just enough to feel the breeze and watch the birds, and one day she found a small flower growing near a rock with blue petals and silver dots like the markings on her arm, and she picked it and brought it back and gave it to Thomas without a word, and he placed it in a glass of water and kept it on the shelf where the sun could touch it. That night, as they sat outside watching the stars, she asked him about the marks on his arm, and he showed her an old burn from long ago. and told her how he had once been in a war and lost people, and how silence became his friend and pained his shadow. And she listened, and for the first time she saw him not just as a human, but as someone broken like her and trying to heal. She didn't speak much, but every word she gave was like a gift, and Thomas never asked for more than she was ready to give. And in return, he offered his time, his space, and his quiet understanding, and with every passing day, the distance between them grew smaller, and the silence between them grew kinder, and her smile became a little stronger, a little brighter, and a little more hers. The morning was quiet as always, but the girl felt something strange in the air, like the wind was warning her not to go, and the trees were whispering, "Stay back," and even the birds seemed nervous as they flew from branch to branch. Without singing, and Thomas stood by the door with 2 bags in his hand and a gentle smile on his face, telling her they needed supplies, and maybe she would like to see the village, and though her heart beat faster, she nodded because she wanted to trust him more than she feared the unknown. The path to the village was long and curved between tall trees and green hills, and the sunlight fell gently on their faces, but inside her chest a storm was building with every step she took closer to the place where other humans lived and judged and stared and remembered what people like her were supposed to be. And when they reached the village edge, she stopped walking for a second, and Thomas looked back with a small nod, as if saying he was there and would not leave her alone. The houses were simple and built from stone and wood, with small gardens outside and narrow streets between them, and as they walked together, people turned and looked. Some froze with wide eyes, and others whispered behind hands, and one old woman gasped and clutched her child as if danger had just entered the square, and the girl lowered her gaze and walked slower while Thomas placed a hand gently on her back, guiding her forward without saying anything. Inside, the small market people stepped away as they passed, and one man shouted something rude that she could not understand, but his tone was sharp like a knife, and another laughed as he pointed at the marks on her arms, calling her a cursed thing and a walking shadow. And Thomas stopped and turned toward them, not with anger but with calm strength, and said, "She is under my roof and my protection, and if you have a problem with that, then speak to me, not to her." They moved quickly from stall to stall, buying fruits and bread and some medicine herbs, and though most sellers refused to look at the girl, one old man gave her an apple without a word, and she stared at him with wide eyes, unsure if it was kindness or a mistake, and when she reached for it, he only nodded and turned away, and that moment stayed with her as something new, something strange, something warm. As they left the market and headed back toward the path, people watched in silence, and one child asked her mother why the monster was wearing a dress, and the mother pulled him away harshly without answering, and the girl kept walking, but her eyes burned and her throat felt tight, and Thomas looked at her and whispered only one sentence, "Do not let their fear become your truth." And she held on to those words like a shield. Back at the cabin, she sat by the fire without speaking, and the apple still in her hand, untouched, and her body trembling not from cold, but from a flood of memories and emotions crashing through her like waves. And Thomas brought her tea, and said nothing, waiting until she was ready, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough and filled with broken pieces, and she asked, "Why do they hate me when they don't even know my name?" Thomas sat beside her and told her about the village, and how fear lives longer than reason, and how stories told in anger grow sharper with time, and how people who do not understand will always choose the easy answer and blame what is different and strange. And he said he once thought the same way, until loss broke him open and showed him what truly matters, and she looked at him and saw truth in his eyes. That night, the girl did not sleep, but walked outside and looked up at the stars, and remembered the sky of her home planet, and how different it looked with 2 moons and purple clouds, and how her mother used to sing when fear crept into their hearts, and she whispered that song now in a broken voice, not for comfort, but for strength. And Trees listened, and the stars blinked, and something inside her grew stronger. Next morning, she woke early and cleaned the small house and cooked with the fruits they had bought, and when Thomas came into the room, she placed the apple on his plate and said thank you in his language, and he smiled and said, "You're welcome," with a voice full of light, and she nodded, not because everything was okay, but because she wanted to keep walking forward, even if the road was filled with stones. Later that day, she picked up a small piece of wood and began carving shapes into it with a sharp stone, and though her hands were clumsy and the lines were rough, she kept going because creating something felt like claiming space and making her mark on the world. And Thomas watched from the window. Can did not interrupt because he knew the value of quiet moments and small victories. So the girl kept moving, kept breathing, kept learning, and though the village hated her and the past still haunted her, she knew now that one man's kindness could become a bridge, and one smile could begin to rebuild a name and a life that had been almost lost forever. The sky was covered in heavy clouds, as if the earth itself had held its breath, and the wind carried a warning that neither the girl nor Thomas understood. And inside the small wooden house, everything seemed calm, but the air had changed, and even the birds were silent that morning as the girl poured water into a pot, and Thomas fixed a broken chair near the window with his usual quiet focus, while something unseen moved closer with every passing second. She felt it before she saw it, a strange pull in her stomach, like the kind she used to feel when her captors approached back in the slave markets. A tightness in her chest that whispered run or fight, and she looked at Thomas, who seemed unaware as he hummed a soft tune, and for a moment she told herself maybe it was nothing, maybe this peace would not break. Today, maybe the world would let them have one more normal day. But then the sound of boots crushed the gravel path outside, and 4 tall figures appeared at the edge of the trees wearing black armor and long coats, and each one carried weapons that hummed with dark energy, and the girl froze. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind screamed old words, danger, threat, trap, and her legs moved before thought took over. As she stepped in front of Thomas without a plan, only instinct, door burst open with a loud crack, and the tallest of the strangers stepped inside with a sneer on his face and a small device in his hand that flashed red and scanned the girl from head to toe before he turned toward Thomas and said, "She is marked property of Sector 9. And you have no right to keep her. She belongs to us." And the others raised their weapons as if her body were stewed, just to claim to be taken back. Thomas stood up slowly and placed the broken chair aside with calm hands and said, "She is not a thing, and she is not yours. She stays here." And the leader laughed a cold, empty sound as he pointed his weapon at Thomas and said, "You do not decide, human. The contract is written and blood was paid, and she is ours now. Move aside or die for a cause that means nothing." The girl stepped forward, her eyes wide with fire, as she shook her head and said, "I am not yours, not anymore." And the leader's face twisted with anger as he raised his weapon and fired, but the blast missed as of. Thomas shoved her aside, taking the hit to his side with a grunt, and the sound made her scream, not from fear, but from rage and pain and something ancient inside her woke, her body moved on its own, like memory had returned, like every moment of suffering had carved strength into her bones, and she grabbed the small blade Thomas used in the garden and charged without thinking and without mercy, and the first attacker did not see her coming as she struck his leg, then ducked under a wild swing and slammed her shoulder into his chest, knocking him down. The second one caught her arm, but she twisted free and kicked his knee, making him stumble, and she took his weapon and pointed it at the third, who hesitated, seeing her eyes and her stance and the energy she carried like thunder in a storm, and she said, "Leave now, or I swear I will burn your name from every record in the sky." And they looked at each other, then back at her, and slowly stepped away, dragging their wounded with them. When the door closed and silence returned, she dropped the weapon and fell to her knees beside Thomas, who lay on the floor with blood on his shirt and a pale look on his face, and she touched his face with shaking hands, whispering his name again and again, and he opened his eyes and smiled weakly, saying, "You fought for me," and she nodded through tears, saying, "Just like you fought for Mesh," dragged him to the bed, and used every herb, every cloth, every skill she had learned from watching him and from remembering old remedies from her people, and through the night she sat by his side, not moving, not sleeping, not thinking of anything else, but keeping his chest rising and his heart beating. And she spoke to him in her native tongue songs and stories and promises that he could not understand, but that somehow reached him in the morning. His breathing steadied and his skin warmed, and when he opened his eyes again,
she smiled.
Not a small, shy smile, but a full and bright one that carried everything she had ever felt and feared and survived. And he reached for her hand and said, "Thank you." And she said, "No, thank you." And together they lay there in the quiet house, holding on to each other. Like the storm had passed and left something new behind. She knew then that she would never run again, not because she owed him, not because she was trapped, but because she had chosen this place, this man, this moment, and that choice made her stronger than any chain ever could. And from that day forward, the girl who once belonged to no one began to belong to herself. Rain fell softly on the wooden roof, tapping a slow rhythm that echoed through the quiet house, and the girl sat by the fire holding a warm cloth against Thomas's side where the wound had begun to heal, and his breath was steady now, but weak and slow, like an old song played on a tired instrument, and she watched him sleep with eyes full of silence and memory, and her hands trembled not from fear, but from something deeper, something older, something locked inside her for too long. Storm outside reminded her of a different rain, one that fell on the day her world ended, and she closed her eyes as the fire crackled and took her back to the sky of her home, with purple clouds and twin moons and soft lights that danced across the air, and she saw her mother again with gentle hands weaving beads into her hair, and her father laughing as he lifted her sister onto his shoulders, and her voice cracked as she whispered their names. To the empty room, Thomas stirred in his sleep, and she wiped her face quickly, not wanting him to see her tears, but when he opened his eyes and looked at her, she saw that he already knew, and without saying a word, he reached out his hand, and she took it and sat beside him on the edge of the bed, and after a long moment of silence, she began to speak. Her voice slow and dry like wind over dust, she told him about the war that came without warning, with fire and smoke and metal ships that blotted out the stars, and soldiers who wore no faces and spoke in numbers, and how her people were taken one by one, her family separated, her name erased, and her body turned into something to be sold and used and discarded. And she told him about the camps and the cages and the screams and the silence that followed, and how she stopped speaking because no one listened and no one cared. Thomas listened with eyes that did not blink, and hands that held hers gently, without squeezing, without pulling, and when she finished her story, she expected him to speak, to ask something, to offer comfort or pity, but he only nodded slowly and closed his eyes and began to tell his own story with a voice that broke and rebuilt itself with every word. He spoke of a different war, a war of humans against humans, and how he had once worn a uniform and believed in rules and missions and orders until the day those orders led to the loss of everything he loved, and how his wife had died from sickness because no one came in time, and how his daughter had been taken by strangers who called it rescue but never returned, and how he had wandered after that, lost and broken and tired, until he found this house and decided to stay still. The fire burned lower, and the rain grew louder, and their words filled the space between them, not like chains, but like bridges. And for the first time, the girl felt the weight in her chest shift, as if something long buried had been touched and understood and accepted, and she leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, gently, and he placed his hand over hers, and they sat there, not as master and rescued, not as human and alien, but as two souls scarred. And surviving days passed slowly, and Thomas grew stronger, and she began to walk farther into the forest, finding new plants and hidden flowers, and once she saw a deer with silver eyes that stared at her without fear, and she stared back, wondering if this was what peace looked like, not loud or bright, but quiet and wild, and full of things that could not be bought or owned at. Night they read books together, with small candles flickering, and she learned new words and taught him some of hers. And sometimes they laughed, and sometimes they sat in silence, and one evening, she carved a small bird from a piece of wood and gave it to him, and he smiled and placed it on the shelf beside the blue flower she had picked weeks ago. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, she stood at the edge of the path holding a small bag with dried herbs and bandages, and said she wanted to go to the village, not for supplies, but to help. And Thomas looked at her with both pride and worry, and said, "You do not have to prove anything." And she said, "I know, but I want to," and that made all the difference. She walked into the village slowly with her head high and her hands steady, and though people still stared, they did not speak. And when she reached the old man, who had once given her an apple, she offered him a jar of medicine she had made, and he took it with a nod and said thank you, and that word held more weight than all the stairs in the world. That evening she returned to the cabin, and Thomas was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of tea and a smile that said he had believed in her even when she doubted herself, and they sat together under the sky that was now turning gold and pink, and she whispered that maybe names could be given again, and maybe hers would be hope, and Thomas said that sounded just right. The wind carried the scent of flowers and dust as the sun rose behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the girl, now known as Hope, stood near the wooden porch, watching the morning begin with a calm heart and clear eyes. And the air around her felt light, as if the world had finally exhaled, and she could feel the soil beneath her feet and the sky above her head, like a promise made only to her inside the cabin. Thomas moved slowly, still healing, but stronger each day, and he placed his carved bird on the table next to the books and the dried herbs, and he looked out the window to see her standing in the light with her arms open and her face lifted. And he smiled, not because she had changed, but because she had remembered who she was before the pain, before the chains, before the silence. The village had started to change too, in small ways, like nods from strangers or short greetings from those who once turned away, and though not everyone accepted her presence, she had stopped waiting for their permission to exist, and she walked through the streets with her head high, her bag full of healing plants, and her name spoken softly by children who once stared at her with fear. One afternoon a message arrived from a nearby town where rumors of her rescue and strength had reached ears that once bought and sold bodies, and the message carried a threat to Thomas and to her, and she read it with a steady hand and a calm breath, and then looked up and said, "We end this." And Thomas nodded, because he knew running was never her way, and hiding was not a life, and fear was no longer welcome in their home. They prepared quietly, packing tools and supplies, and Thomas crafted a strong staff from the oldest tree in the forest, while she shaped a shield from metal scraps and painted it with the stars of her lost world, and they rode into the night under a sky full of fireflies and memory, heading back to the place where her name had been stolen and her life had been sold. The auction house still stood at the edge of the black market, hidden in shadows and silence, and she walked through its doors with her heart steady and her voice loud, calling out the names of those who had bought and broken and vanished into the dark. And the crowd turned to see her not as a victim, but as a storm. And when she pointed to the man who once claimed her as his property, he laughed until she spoke her new name. She said, "I am Hope, and I do not belong to you, and I never did." And those words shook the walls like thunder, and Thomas stood beside her, not with weapons drawn, but with his hand over his heart, and the old man's laughter died in his throat as the crowd around them began to murmur and move, because stories travel fast, and legends even faster, and none wanted to stand against the girl who came back with fire in her eyes and light in her name. Auction house closed that day, not with flames or fights, but with silence, as its doors were shut by those who once worked inside and walked away, and hope placed a single blue flower on the steps, as a symbol not of victory, but of peace. And they returned to their village as the sky turned pink and gold again, and the wind carried the scent of something new. Seasons changed, and the cabin grew into a home with walls covered in books and shelves filled with carvings and jars of healing roots and flowers, and visitors came from far places to speak with the girl who once had no name and left with stories in their hearts and hope in their hands. And Thomas grew older, but not weaker, and his smile never faded, because he had found his daughter in spirit and his reason to stay. One morning Hope stood at the edge of the forest with a group of children from the village and told them about stars that danced in lands with twin moons and songs sung by mothers with hands full of light, and she taught them the names of flowers in her language and showed them how to listen to trees and speak with kindness, and they laughed with her, not at her, and that laughter healed something deep inside her that even she did not know was still broken. At night she sat by the fire with Thomas, reading old tales and carving small animals for the village market, and sometimes she held the blue flower he had kept all this time and whispered stories to the flames about loss and healing and second chances. And her voice was strong, not loud, but full and true, like a river flowing after a long winter, and her smile reached her eyes and stayed in. When strangers asked who she was and what she had been before, she simply said, "I am Hope." And that was enough, not because it erased the pain or the past, but because it carried the truth of her journey and the power of her choice, and the story of a girl once lost, now found, not by a hero, but by a man who believed kindness was stronger than chains, and who gave her nothing more and nothing less than a place to begin again.